actually going to kick this off. Our narrative change project is really designed to help tell untold stories about San Antonio. We're all neighbors. We're all here because we're very passionate about the city, the beauty, the realities, the pain, and the actual just magnificent of San Antonio and what it offers. And so I am going to go ahead and just jump in. This is San Antonio's Roadmap to Justice. And we have two very special individuals who are going to engage in a lively conversation. I encourage you to be part of that conversation. Feel free to use the chat room to share your thoughts with us. We want to definitely hear from you. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn this over to my friend, my colleague, Patton Dodd, who's going to kick us off for this conversation today.
Thanks, Dacre. Hey, everybody. It's good to see y'all. I'm excited about this this next hour and change we have. So yeah, we're going to hear today from Dr. Carey Latimore. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about Carey to set him up and then turn it over to him. So Carey Latimore is an associate professor of history and co-director of the African American Studies program at Trinity University here in San Antonio. And as many of you will know, if you're from San Antonio, and I know, as Dacre mentioned, we're not all from San Antonio. I see you, Rudy, and I see you, Carla, and all the way from Cornwall in the UK. We've got Matt here and others from everywhere, and it's really fun. But if you pay attention to the news in San Antonio, you may know that Carey has popped up here and there in the last year or so in press coverage for his work with the Alamo Plan, which is the big and notorious plan to renovate and remodel the grounds all around the Alamo. And again, as you probably know, all sorts of things about these renovation plans have been controversial. And one of the controversial issues is just how far those grounds extend. If you've been there, you know what it looks like now. And what's considered kind of the park where we can visit the mission. But there's other things of historical significance that happened around there in the century plus following the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. And Carey was asked to dig deeply into one particular piece of that story, as I understand it, which is the historical value of the Woolworth building, which is on the corner of Alamo and Houston Street, across the street from the Alamo. Because we know that that building was a key site in the civil rights movement. And on that spot, the peaceful desegregation of lunch counters occurred in March of 1960, 61 years ago this March. That wasn't the only place where it occurred. There were other, I think 7 other spots or 6 other spots along the way in downtown San Antonio, but the Woolworth building was a key location. So Carey was asked to do some digging into that story and what all we need to know about it. And you can read Carey's paper that he produced from the Alamo Plan. We'll drop that in the chat. It's been published publicly. But in that paper, Carey tells a story that is much broader than just one building, and really even just one moment of those lunch counter protests. He looks back at the decades before the civil rights movement, but also, and this is what got me and Dacre excited about talking to him, is that Carey looks closely at the people, the characters, like the men and women who made the movement in San Antonio, the civil rights movement, what it was here. Who were they? How did they come together? You saw some of their faces in the slideshow a few moments ago, faith leaders and business owners especially, who coordinated their efforts through their relationships toward building justice in San Antonio. Some of those faces may be familiar to you, but probably most of them aren't. And really very few of them are household names. I mean, there are no monuments to these people in our city, and perhaps that should change. But the work they did and the way they did it, we think presents a kind of roadmap for us today who are concerned for justice and for equity in San Antonio. I mean, the building of that justice, that equity is not always clear. And even parts of the map are complicated and messy and undone. But these stories, if we pay attention to them, we think can help us find our way in building a more equitable, more fair San Antonio, where more people have the opportunity to flourish. And so with Carey's help today, we're gonna listen and learn a bit about these folks and what they did. Carey's gonna give us an overview of some of his findings for a few minutes, you know, the good, bad, ugly, the in-between. And then I'm gonna ask Carey some follow-up questions after he talks. and we'll have a conversation for a bit. And I want to invite you to be jotting down your own thoughts and questions, putting them in our chat if you want to, and we'll invite some of your voices near the end of our time together to join into the conversation. So, Carey Latimore, over to you.
Well, thank you, Patton. It's been my pleasure, and I certainly enjoy working with the foundation, and it is definitely an honor to be here. I don't have a lot of time, so some of you may have known some of the people in the pictures earlier. I know a couple of you certainly may remember some of them. Perhaps you went to attend a synagogue or a church with some of them. So if you knew anyone in those pictures or know a story, please share that with us in the chat space. Now, President Biden, in his inaugural address, challenged all of us to work together to find solutions to the great problems that our nation and world faces. In a divided world such as the one that we live in right now, his message was simple, yet bold. President Biden's words, unfortunately, probably will not find resonance in the corners of either party. And yet he still demanded that the rest of us come together to find ways to work together, to find ways to compromise together, to find ways to engage together. Now, as you can imagine, this type of work is hard. It's hard because we all want what we want, right? And progress yet is often slow and arduous. It's painful. Nelson Mandela's autobiography was aptly named Long Walk to Freedom. It doesn't mean a short walk, it's a long walk, and certainly in his life, it was a long walk. But just because the work of justice is slow, just because we may not get everything that we want, it doesn't mean that we should not try to build and construct the relationships to reach across the great divides. Today, I want to speak to you about a roadmap for doing so. It's a roadmap for justice. If you are my age, I'm 45, I'm getting up there, or older, you may remember using real roadmaps and not Siri. In those maps, you could not see how long the road was going to take you. With those maps, I remember sometimes we'd have my mother's Thunderbird and my dad and I'd be sitting in the back seat of the car with a map across the back seat, trying to figure out how to get to a destination. The point is, with a roadmap, it often takes people working together to get to the destination. And that's what finding common ground is like. What happened in our city during the 50s and the 60s was kind of like that roadmap. The city that we live in today, it's a city that we sometimes mostly enjoy today, is a result of a roadmap followed by some important yet imperfect and mostly forgotten leaders from our collective past. Leading up to the Brown decision in 1954 and the Brown II decision a year later, African Americans in San Antonio had little to no ability to change the racial status quo, with the exception of through the military defense industries. San Antonio's racial climate was one where segregation without any legal ordinance of segregation existed. In other words, segregation in San Antonio was local customs, which defined our racial climate. Really, we only had one real segregation ordinance, and that was a Juneteenth ordinance, and we can talk about that later, and I'll tell you what that meant. But really, it's local climates, our racial climate, that defines the way that we deal with race and ethnicity. Indeed, it still is in our city. But even in that mist of that storm, a little light was pressing through and pushing through the clouds. The roadmap shows us that coalitions emerged, uniting a few diverse people from the business, civic, political, and religious worlds. Of course, Black people were the main protagonists. And yet when you read the Express or other newspapers of the period after the Brown decision, it's stunning the hope that the people have. A Dr. Ruth Bellinger, a local physician and former president of the local chapter of the NAACP, states, quote, "It marks a milestone in the ethical and moral awakening of America." Quotes from the Catholic Church under the directive of Archbishop Robert Lucy. "It's absolutely marvelous. It's a great blessing to the people on the national level and internationally because the whole world has been waiting for this decision." Dr. John Brown, pastor of South San Antonio Baptist Church, a white man born in Birmingham who resided in Louisiana, not the most open places at that time, stated, I think that the Supreme Court ruling is one of the most important steps we have ever taken. It should have been taken half a century ago or longer. We are equals in the sight of God. 2 city council members, the only 2 really at this early point, Henry B. Gonzalez and Emil Schillerin, cited their Catholic faith for convincing them that desegregation was the way to go. And so in America, as America ripped apart over desegregation and the Brown decisions and the response to that, there was a coalition that emerged in San Antonio to push for a more equal and inclusive San Antonio, bringing together people from the Jewish community, business community, Baptist community, other communities. Now, what I want to focus on is that everyone in that coalition didn't think the same ways. They didn't all support desegregation for the same reasons. Some truly believed in equal rights. Others believed that desegregation was, for lack of a better word, good business. Others supported it as long as it was voluntary desegregation. But between 1954, 55, and 59, change was coming. It was hard, and it took a lot of work by a few people. But that kind of change led towards most schools, public swimming pools, golf courses, and then by the end of around the 60s, most theaters had made moves towards desegregation. Not fully, but moves towards desegregation. Now that coalition kind of set towards reaching an apex in 1960 during the lunch counter movement. Now, San Antonio was not the first city in America to deal with lunch counter protests. We can go back, it's a long history of it, beginning in North Carolina. But what was happening in San Antonio, or what was threatening to happen in San Antonio, really challenged people. The supporters of desegregation, many of them belonging to a group called the Council of Churches, were wary of what might happen if the sit-ins came to San Antonio. And they were also worried about what might happen to the business community. And so led by Reverend Don Baugh and others, the Council of Churches and others tried to find a way for a peaceful solution. But again, they also recognized the cost of local businesses. One business manager of one of the businesses in town, probably Crest or Woolworth or one of the others, stated that in another city, business fell off 45 to 60% in that city. The threat of trouble in San Antonio was palpable. Austin, Galveston, demonstrations have become testing and teetered on the edge of violence. On March 12th, African Americans in Galveston protested the lunch counter segregation by entering 3 Galveston stores. All of those stores were closed. In Houston, 5 lunch counters closed by demonstrators, and 1 was closed the following Monday. Nationally, the situation was even worse. On March 12th, more than 200 student protesters were arrested in Tallahassee. African Americans in San Antonio saw this as an opportunity if action could not be taken, or if action against us was not taken. But they were working with other leaders. So they were working with the Council of Churches, or at least they were engaging with them. Harry Burns, Mary Lillian Andrews, and others kind of forced the business, religious, and civil leaders who were interested in desegregation to move forward. And so because of their actions, meetings for dealing with the situation were pressed up, pressed ahead, moved forward. And yet people like Burns and others were constantly communicating, saying, if you don't do these things, we might instigate sit-ins. And so on March 16th, decision was made to integrate the lunch counters, or at least the downtown lunch counters. But yet, as we see, progress is not always perfect progress. Today, we might see that as problematic. Business owners requested a few concessions. They demanded that Black leaders inform African Americans to not rush to the stores and lunch counters too quickly. Why? Store managers didn't want lunch counters to be flooded with too many African Americans. 2, business leaders requested that African Americans not take any action on non-conforming stores, Joskies, for at least 30 days. And the final thing was an agreement with local newspapers to not make too much of a scene of this. And so one of the reasons why we don't know a lot about that day in which the downtown lunch counters were desegregated is because the newspapers didn't make a big deal of it. You often have to go outside of San Antonio newspapers to learn more about what was happening. That's why the story that the Crest building was the first building desegregated did not always reach us, because it was not really discussed in San Antonio. So the story is San Antonio's downtown was mostly desegregated. It was not a complete victory. The city had much work left to do, work that still is left for us to do. But yet the fact does not diminish what happened 61 years ago. Leaders in our city followed a roadmap to push towards a new and more inclusive San Antonio. It was not a perfect roadmap. It looked just like a roadmap with many different roads crossing this way and that way. But they got progress done. The question is, are we willing and humble enough to follow a similar roadmap? Now, I'm an optimist. I think if we do this and we come together and unified, we might even be able to do better and accomplish even more than they accomplished. Thank you.
Thanks, Carey. Man, there's a lot to untangle, I think. I mean, that was clear. You were clear, but I still think there's a lot to sort of tease out of that account. And I think I want to begin with one of the first things you said about the fact that there was no segregation ordinance in San Antonio. And in your paper, you make a point of saying that San Antonio had a reputation for progressivism, actually, in the 50s and early 60s, and for this desegregation moment where it did get attention. But African-American people here knew that the reality was different. And I think that tension between the city's reputation and the reality for some Black and Brown folks is not only interesting to note and to think about, but also parallel to today. I mean, I hear hints of today's San Antonio when I read that, because there's a lot of great things about living here. It's a beloved city, it's charming. This is a great place to raise a family is like a really common used phrase, city on the rise, you know, that kind of stuff. And those things are true. And we have a reputation for, just for being a nice place to be for everyone. And yet we know that there is, a history of segregation. There is the widest gap in wealth, among the widest gaps in wealth in the nation. So I'd love to hear you reflect on this tension. How did the African-American community experience San Antonio in the 50s? How did that belie its reputation for kind of progressivism and an openness to all? How did that harm the city back then? And what parallels do you see for today?
That's a lot of question pattern there, and I'll do my best to get there. One of the things that we must remember is that just because many San Antonio leaders would say that San Antonio is a better city for African Americans than other cities. But let's also think and remember that just because we didn't have lynchings happening every day, that doesn't necessarily mean that the situation on the ground was so progressive. And so we had leaders, mayors, who would say things like, San Antonio has no race problems, which is certainly not true when African Americans did not even want to come to San Antonio because of the race problems down here. So I think we have to recognize that just because we didn't have the local ordinances, local norms can control how people live and act. And if you look at access to jobs and other kinds of things, African Americans are largely shut out of those opportunities, particularly in the upper levels. And so you may have a legal opening, and you may have the reality that African Americans are about 6 to 12% of the population, depending on when and where you take that number. Maybe there were more openings in some ways, but life on the ground was not easy. The relationship between African Americans and cops was always difficult in San Antonio. There were a number of African Americans murdered by cops. And so that's an issue. And that's one of the things of San Antonio that we see placed in the newspapers of this place of progressivism. But on the other end, the realities. On one end, it allows us to desegregate a little bit earlier. But on the other end, San Antonio is a southern city with some Western influences. So it's kind of pulled in two different directions. And so I think when you look at it, we got many Southern ways, but other Western ways as well. And so both of those aspects, the Western, in which you have the diversity and a little more openness, are competing against each other and struggling against each other. So those conflicts, the way you see the religious leaders somewhat coming together, but you see the pull towards segregation. And so it's a conflict in a sense. And I think San Antonio still struggles with it. That's why we have so many school districts, et cetera. We're a divided city, still are. When I first moved here, people told me about the sides of the city and they defined them by race. I grew up in Virginia. People didn't define places by race like that. I found that out down here much more about spaces and race than I did in Virginia.
Wow. That the thing you said about the Western and Southern, kind of the intersection of Western ways and Southern ways in San Antonio, I'm curious how that relates to kind of our built environment. Like, what are the differences between a Western and a Southern city, and how does that how is that something we can see in the way the city is laid out?
I think in the ways that it's laid out, it's more of kind of an ethos. When I think about an ethos, I think about Southern cities we tend to think are Black and white, or Black spaces, and that have a long legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We have that in San Antonio, but not in the same way that you have it in, say, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. We don't have the cotton industry in the same kind of way here. Although to Wilson County and other spaces, you might have a little bit of that. To South San Antonio, you may have a little bit of that as well, but not in the same kind of way. And so you've also got a little more diversity. So you have a large Latino population here. You don't really have that in other spaces. And so the population of African Americans, when we start to think about this versus other Southern cities, is a lot less. And so citywide, people may perceive the African American threat as not as great as it is in other larger Southern cities. And so
I wonder if that Western aspect actually makes it a little bit more hard to identify, the kinds of segregation that you're talking about, right? It's not, it's a little bit more invisible.
So. I mean, again, the segregation is here. But sometimes the restrictions are not as great here as it is in other spaces. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I think that it would have been hard to do this and what we talked about in 1960 in a city like Mobile, or certainly in Richmond. I think it would have been a lot more difficult. So the opportunities are here, but it's still a long walk because we're still in the Southern aspects come. It doesn't mean that the West is completely open and liberal or progressive. I mean, Seattle had some of the worst restrictive covenants in the United States. So there you go.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this issue of coalition building that you mentioned, and kind of the messiness of the coalition. The coalition you described that got lunch counters desegregated was not very pure. You said people kind of came to it with different reasons and gave up different things. And it's interesting because today we talk a lot about, you hear a lot about kind of ideological purity, within groups and tribes. And so, like, how do you, I guess, when we look to history, what does it teach us about how to balance what gets lost and what gets gained in coalition building and in compromise?
I think, for me, one of the things that King did well, other great civil rights leaders did very well, was recognize that bridge building is important if you want to accomplish things, and you have to try to find a way to bridge between people who have differences of opinions. And ideological purity sometimes feels good, but it doesn't always accomplish a lot. We probably could have had healthcare reform a lot earlier if we didn't have as much ideological purity. That's just me throwing it out there with what I remember from the early 90s. We cannot, I think, in pushing for these things, you still have to reach across the bridge a little bit. And the people that were working together had tremendous differences, and that ended up sometimes splitting that movement. We didn't have a non-discrimination ordinance passed in San Antonio when it should have been passed. because people were not fully, the coalition couldn't come together on that. And that was one of the problems of that coalition, is that it could not. But that doesn't mean that it's not something that should have been tried or accomplished.
Yeah.
I think that when you look politically at our society right now, you have a left and a right, but I think you probably have a larger number of people that fit kind of in the middle, the middle left, the middle right, but you kind of hear the ideological purity spoken on those two corners. But yet there's, I think, a lot of possibilities of working together within that middle, but we don't often think about that. Certainly when you can defriend people for having a different opinion of this or that.
Yeah.
But I think that conversation is something that we've lost. The ability, I grew up in Virginia, and it was a very difficult place to grow up. And my father, he went through a heck of a lot more than I did, but I saw him communicate with people who had some horrific beliefs, but yet somehow he was able to engage with them and to work in ways of creating change. And I think that somehow we've forgotten that. When I hear people say, I won't work with that person because of this view of that person, that's not an easy way to me of making progress. I think
that kind of gets us to some of the brass tacks of what it's like to do that work. I mean, when I hear you tell the story about the desegregation of downtown San Antonio, I imagine all the things that led up to that. We can talk about kind of coalition building in a high level way, but there's also just the rigor of the day-to-day things that those people did, full of phone calls, long conversations, probably mundane disagreements over strategy, making lists of who owns what store and who needs to be at this meeting or that meeting. It's organizing strategy and follow through. And is that right? I mean, do you know much about how that worked, like how that group came together and how those connections happened, and what is the work that they did?
I mean, I think a lot of them had, the religious community, they had interactions throughout. You had groups like, as I said, the Council of Churches, so that they were, Council of Churches, that kind of means that they were kind of together in that way because they were dealing with those perspectives. Our Catholic Church has a reach. But I think that people were looking for allies in any kind of way. And San Antonio is, in a weird way, still a small town with kind of, and I think it kind of existed back then. People knew each other, and so they worked with each other. They interacted with each other. But the work of someone who's trying to work for justice is difficult work, and so it required being on the phone, talking to the media, knowing how, Harry Burns has to know how to manipulate the media, and to work with them. The NAACP has to know how to work that out. So you have people who are really smart, and yet it also takes compromise. And Harry Burns gave an interview in 1994 in which he talked about that kind of compromise. He ended up working with one of the mayors, McAllister, who was not always on the right side of civil rights. And it caused some issues within his community. He said, but I still worked with him at a point in time. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm his friend, but I worked with him. And I think about the people of the past who I admire, and I recognize that sometimes behind closed doors, they found ways of working with people and maybe shifting just a little bit. I think that's something that we've lost.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to ask you about Harry Burns, and then I have one other question for you. And then we have so much great stuff happening in the chat that I think that we should turn it over to the chat. Maybe Marcus and Dockery can be pulling out some of the key questions that we're seeing over the next couple minutes. But I want to mention Harry Burns for a moment, because you mentioned him twice just now. He's a remarkable man. And it sounds like he is kind of the one, you can correct me if I'm wrong, who led this lunch counter effort in 1960. And then in your paper, there's a photo of him picketing City Hall 3 years later in 1963. And at that point, he's basically alone. I think there's one other person in that photo. And I get the sense of him as a guy that was leading and pushing. We don't really know much about him anymore. We don't talk about him. I had never heard of him before until I read your paper. And knowing that he did what he did, it feels to me like he ought to be a legendary figure in San Antonio. He ought to be a known name. Maybe there's a street named after him. I don't know. But there ought to be if there's not. And what else do we know about Harry Burns? And do we know anything about the work that he did and his relationships with these ministers in town?
He wasn't born here. He was a military person, so he worked. I noted that African Americans had a better time working in the military and the defense industry, and that's because of the World War II executive orders that kind of supposedly desegregated the military, supposedly. Because of that, there was more openness for people who worked in the defense industry to speak on civil rights. And so because of that, many of your African American leaders came from the military area because they had more bandwidth to speak than other people who may have worked in other industries. They didn't have to fear for their jobs as much, although they certainly had some things to fear. Harry Burns worked with the NAACP. He was a youth organizer in some senses. He wanted to be an accountant, but he wanted to go to graduate school, but he was excluded from that. But then he later entered graduate school, so he's a very educated man, brilliant man. He ends up in some ways, I think, working with the Good Government League later in his life. And the Good Government League, that's a large other story. It's basically an organization that ran San Antonio, I think from the 50s through the 70s. And so they kind of controlled they basically decided who was going to be mayor and the city councilman and all those other kinds of things. And they ran tickets and they had a lot of money. They wanted to run San Antonio like a business. By the 70s, for a variety of reasons, they were out. But Harry Burns was a person that would work with anybody to get what he wanted, but he was directing what he wanted. He spoke up directly, specifically. He knew how to negotiate and work with the media. He is certainly a person that was always for Black independence and Black rights. Somebody who I think we should know a lot more about. I mean, we often hear about the G.J. Suttons, the Sutton family, and they've done tremendous work. And Claude Black. There are other families and people. There's one who's here, Mario Salas is in the house. If we had extended the paper a little bit later, his work would have come in. The Bellinger family, Ruth Bellinger. I mean, all of these people were in some ways working for a greater San Antonio, and we've kind of forgotten them. And I think that we could do a lot more to memorialize them. I mean, kind of the story of civil rights in America, we think about the great people, but there are so many people under that umbrella that have such wonderful stories too that should be shed light on. And certainly Harry Burns is one. Brilliant, political, knows how to make alliances. Sometimes that upsets people, but great leaders often do things that upset people because they make alliances that people may not agree with, but they get things done. And I think that was Harry Burns. We may not always agree with him, but he did get some things done.
Look at this.
He was persistent.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really stirring to think about that man. Look at this a gem of a comment from Mario Salas. Harry Burns worked with me and others in a group called the Black Heritage Council, which had workshops and other events. Thank you for that comment. We definitely would love to hear from more. One more question for Carey, and then we're going to open it up. I want to talk about some of the specific things that that this relates to the work that's in front of San Antonio today. I mean, we're just on the other side of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I'm always reminded this time of year that what often is called the March on Washington or the March for Freedom was actually called the March for Freedom and Jobs. King was fighting for economic justice when he was killed. And when I think about the work of desegregation that you're talking about, Carey, in the civil rights era, there were other really specific ways that desegregation worked itself out locally, which you named some of these in your paper, that Black doctors could become members of the Bexar County Medical Society. Ruth Bellinger and Charles Whittier were admitted as staff at Santa Rosa Hospital, which took, I think, a while to make that happen. And these, they sound mundane, but these are really crucial things that had to take place, rules, that had to be challenged and changed. So the people you're talking about didn't just push for the awareness of high ideals about justice in the abstract. They were about specific things that needed to happen. Open up access to this store, you know, that kind of thing. What are the specific things that people should be advocating for today? If coalitions form, movement building happens, what do you think are the pressure points that people ought to identify?
I think police reform is one of them. And I think that that's something that I think there's a broad consensus on certain things. Qualified immunity, I think most of us can probably agree we can do some work with that to make bad cops more liable to be prosecuted for their acts. I don't necessarily, I think that there are ways of working with people. And so I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I'll go ahead and say it. I don't necessarily believe that using words like defunding is one of the best ways of getting things accomplished, especially if that's not what is intended by the statement in and of itself. So I think that police reform is something that we need and have needed in San Antonio for the last 50, 60 years. And there's some ways that I think that we can do that, but I think it's going to take that broad consensus again. And it may not mean people who have the same ideals, but I think it may bring us that coalition that's needed to create political change on that. I think urban renewal is another area that we could find a little broader consensus. It's not just progress versus gentrification. Can we find ways to keep people in their houses, whether it revise some tax structures and this or that, and allow for progress in neighborhoods? Is it an either or situation? So I think a situation like that is something we can look at. Certainly schools. I believe in public schools. I also recognize that poor families are don't have a lot of options. And a lot of people that are talking on their behalf don't understand their situation in inner city and rural schools. And so maybe a little broader consensus on that. And then I'd say a place like the Alamo, and monuments and the ways that we look at historical memories. There should be more statues out there. There's a space for a Harry Burns. There's a space for a Claude Black. It doesn't just, Claude Black has a lot, but we can have more things for a broader constituency of people. We're fighting over monuments that exist. I think we should be creating opportunities for the monuments of the future too. Because if I tear down all the current monuments, and some of them need to be torn down, but we don't have anything else. And so as an educator, I think young people, and all of us too, need to see more people in those spaces. And so that creates an opportunity. I think when I look at the Alamo, looking at ways of talking about slavery at the Alamo and its implication in the Texas Revolution, finding ways to tell fuller stories that shed light on all human beings and not just one specific story. There's room for that. And I think that it's difficult in expressing that story, just like it was difficult for Monticello to tell a story about Sally Hemings. But in telling that story, it didn't destroy Monticello. I think as Americans, we could do a better job telling our story, the nuts and bolts of it, the good and the bad, and recognizing that sometimes good things are also coming at the result of bad things to other people. And so good principles can sometimes be implemented in harsh ways. And so how do we tell the story in which we get the fullness of that? It doesn't mean that we have to trash everything that is American to tell a fully American story. I don't think that one requires the other. I do think that we have to find a way to open that story up, to tell it more broadly. And I think then it becomes much more interesting. Jefferson is a much more interesting person when we don't look at him as a god, which is odd because he certainly, knowing his views, would not have wanted to see himself as a god. That he was a human being who had faults. Same with Lincoln, the same with all of our leaders who have faults. We can tell that and the other side as well. And so I think that the way that we tell our stories, the way that we look at ourselves as individuals, as people, We all know, I know for myself, I'm a flawed human being. I don't want somebody to tell my story of only the good. There's another part.
Yeah.
Why can't we, as Americans, talk about issues, the Alamo, the American Revolution, the Civil War, in that kind of way, and not just the hero worship? There are heroic acts, don't get me wrong. But there's also another piece that gives a fuller, much more interesting aspect of what happened that we could talk about. And then that allows us to engage with other issues, societal issues, schools, police, etc. When we get over the idea that when we say that people are not, we admit that we're not perfect, then we can deal with imperfect things as a society.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all that, Carey. There's a lot there. Zachary and Marcus, I think I'm gonna just go to the chat. Is that cool if I call on folks, or do you have, okay, great. I randomly, John Hinojosa, I don't know if you want to turn your camera on or if you're still with us. I can just read your question out loud. Oh, there you are.
John, yes.
It's hard to find people in the sea, but John, you wanna just verbalize your question for us? You're muted.
Of course, I need a shirt that says you're muted, and we like it that way. The piece that I think is really important is that we always have to recognize and understand our past, but to move forward and sort of like collectively. And so what the question that I asked is that we know that there was intentional and institutional segregation and racism, and we should never forget that, and how we honor that and how we structure that is really, really important. But what I know from this group and from the good leaders that we have in our city is that there is opportunity for change, and there are opportunities to strengthen who we are as a very diverse and rich, culturally rich community. So what are the steps that we should be taking? It's sort of, I guess, a strategic plan, a master plan. What should be the steps that we're taking as a city, as organizations, and individually?
Ooh, that's another.
Good luck with that, Carey.
I think one of the steps, and I look at an organization like Healthy Futures, and I see that Evelyn Delgado was here, and it may still be here. An organization that I respect a lot, addressing issues of reproductive rights. But yet she was able to she and Jan Riolini put together groups from different parts of that ideological divide. So on her board, there are pro-life people and pro-choice people. It's not an either or organization. And I think that's one of the things that we need, is organizations that seek to build that consensus by putting people together who may not think exactly the same. And actually, we got along. I'm pro-life, I admit that. And we got along, and we were able to work together to find things that we did agree on, and we got a lot accomplished. So I think that's one aspect. I think organizations working together with other organizations. I know on certain areas of town, there's a lot of organizations that are kind of doing the same kinds of things, and they're kind of, specifically on my side of town, they're doing the same things, but they're not working together. And so I think that community, with Harry Burns and others in the past, they seem to know what the others were doing. I think currently we don't know as much about what people are doing, even though we have many more ways of knowing what people are doing. But I think that community aspect is important for finding change and enacting change. And so working together, knowing what the right hand is doing and what the left hand is. I know that sounds simple, but I've seen so many things on certain sides of the city that just are the same things, but they're not working together. And so I think that we need to find that way of working together. I knew that, when I see the mayor and the Bear County, and Nelson Wolf working together. That makes sense that they're talking together. But yet a lot of our organizations aren't doing the same thing, even though they're working within the same grounds. Some of our museum, it's just a lot of times we don't work together because we don't know what's happening. And that's a communication breakdown that I think that our society has too much of right now. There's too much information out there perhaps, and we have overload, and we have to find a way to break down that overload. I don't know what's happening in the city. There could be another talk just like this happening, somewhere else at the same time. I think one of our challenges is going to be, how do we find ways of people who have like minds to communicate with each other to make a pathway forward? Because that was what happened, I think, much easier years ago than today.
I mean, that's why I asked the question about like, what was the sort of mundane off the record work that those guys were doing, Harry Burns and others, like they didn't put out a bat signal for everyone to show up at the lunch counters on the same day. Like they were like making phone calls and meeting, and like they didn't have Facebook, or they couldn't even meet at the same deli because of Jim Crow. Like they had to like organize themselves through rolling up their sleeves and doing just a hard drudgery of strategy and
sometimes they had to meet in private because people didn't want to know. I've heard from leaders on the East Side that certain political leaders who were supposedly against each other often met secretly together, but we don't know about that. I'm not going to get more into detail about that, but that they had relationships, but publicly they had a perspective, but personally they worked together.
And I think that's the point. Like, so it was unsexy work, and it was also relationships that where they even had disagreements, but they would align for a purpose. And as you and Mario have also mentioned, those relationships sustained over time, even after the big kind of flashpoint event. Some of those relationships continued forth. There are several questions in the chat about conflict and left, right, and even kind of violent conflicts as we've seen in the news. I think maybe I want to use Sherry Johnson's question to merge them together. Sherry, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't mind speaking up. It's localism is kind of a way to not only identify what needs to be done, but also deal with conflicts and values and ideology. Sherry?
Oh, thanks. I've just been really interested since getting into narrative as a way of communicating and across difference. That I think what makes narrative, micro narratives, individual narratives so powerful is that I wonder if you've read or are familiar with this idea of Blake Pagenkoff's work on the great conflation. There we go. Where it's like where there's a values axis versus a power axis, right? Where like there's left and right, and we can have diametrically opposed views, but there are ways we can meet in terms of how we meet or where we feel power should be centered locally, kind of that citizenist, individualist narrative, micro narratives piece, or that centralist piece that is about the meta narrative and top-down control and things like that. I just was curious because I heard a lot of what you were saying as being so ingrained in this movement of localism, and if we just talk to each other on this micro narrative level, that's the way we can communicate. Anyway, it's more of a comment and a curiosity than a question. Sorry.
I think that localism is interesting because when you know somebody, you think a lot less of whether they're left or right. Especially the way San Antonio does politics, we don't, we may assume that they're one way or the other, but we're more willing to get out of our political comfort zones, I think, when we know people than when we see them on TV. And so it's the interaction that I think creates interesting kind of relationships. And I'm a Southerner who grew up in the rural South. There's a lot of interactions that happen, and a lot of them happen at night, happen after the sun goes down. And I'm not saying sexually, but people do things in ways that they don't want to be seen doing them. And I saw those kinds of relationships happen a lot. But that's because of the local climate. But people interacted in those kinds of ways. I think that when it is localized, it helps us. There's no way in a national way that Harry Burns and W.W. McAllister would be talking together. And yet somehow in San Antonio, they found a way to do it. I want to reach into a little bit more of that story, but I don't, I'm interested by that story because they're so diametrically opposed on so many different levels. But yet somehow, some way, there was an issue that they found that they could work together. Now, that could only happen in a local way. So I think that that's what you're saying.
Matt Worthington has a heavy question for us about threats that we feel or see to violence. Matt, I don't have any idea if you're still with us.
I am.
Are you? You are. You want to ask your question to Carey, and I think we should just try to connect it to, ultimately the issue of, creating more fairer opportunity across San Antonio, economic justice and a decrease in our segregated city. So anyway, Matt, can you rephrase that for Carey?
Yeah, so, and that's kind of how I try to frame it. I said, how does the kind of open violence that we saw on January 6th, from militia groups that are driven by white supremacy, things like QAnon, has that factor into a push for improved civil rights and a more just society that has better opportunity today, especially given that these groups exist. There are some of these folks in San Antonio, and they exist not just in San Antonio, but outside of San Antonio. And it's very clear that that there is a form of networking, right? And I know that forms of violence were displayed in the past, but I don't want to assume that they were just all that. It's, what's happening today is the exact same thing that's happening back then. So how is progress made and reconciliation advanced after what we saw on January 6th in light of this known source of naked aggression and hatred?
I think one of the things that we need to do about January 6th, and I think this is an area where the media, I don't think, got it and has gotten it about what's happened on that aspect. If you have the money to go to DC and take time from your job, you're not the poorest of the poor. And there's been this image of this movement being people who've been left out of society. And that these are the people who the politicians have not spoken to, who society's left behind. I'm not sure how many people from Appalachia were in DC on January 6th. So I'm not sure if these are the people that have been left behind, or these are the people who see a life in America and they see a life in America that's been imaged for them, and that they see that life dying out or changing. And so they're challenged by the changing structure of America and a broadening of the American story. So I think for them, we've got to say the story the media has portrayed often about them is incorrect. And I think we're getting it a little bit better, but these are not people who've been left outside because of income inequality. That's another aspect that we certainly could talk about, income inequality, but for white America in certain areas. But I think that's different than the people who were in DC on January 6th. One of the things that we also have to recognize is that income inequality there are reasons that it's here. There are reasons that San Antonio is segregated the way that it is. And that leads back to decisions made by, from Jim Crow, but also by the federal government in the 30s and 40s, in which loans were given to certain communities, loans were not given to other communities. The Housing Authority and others really ensured that the east side, the west side, the south side looked a lot different from the more northern parts of the city at that time. And so to change those things really means one, understanding, but then creating and crafting policies that are more equitable in the way that resources have been allocated. If you look at the Good Government League, much of their resources were not allocated to the poorest areas of the city, be that as it may. So I think I probably didn't answer the question exactly, but I think with January 6th, we need to recognize and study it for what it is. These are people who feel that the American story is leaving them behind, where in reality, the American story that they understand is different from the American story. And so that's why we have to tell the story right, because when you don't tell the American story right, you end up with January 6th. When you don't talk about our relationship with slavery, our relationship with race, our relationship with all those things, you end up with January 6th. If you tell the story more fully, as people grow up, they become more open in the way that they look at the American story. So I hate to throw the Alamo out here again. That's why I was concerned when we say we don't want an Alamo plan. We want to tell the story of only the battle. That's the kind of talk that gets us to January 6th. And I'm not saying that there are people that were there at January 6th, but that's the kind of imagery of history that doesn't allow, that kind of fills people who were there on January 6th with images of America that are simply untrue, but they're willing to die for an untrue vision of America.
Wow, this connects to so much. I think the work you're just talking about, I don't want to make this too neat, but that is the work that we're trying to do, storytelling about San Antonio that is truer and deeper and richer, to produce, better social outcomes. Mario, you've put so much in the chat, and we have about 2 hours worth of follow-ups to do with you, but we can't do that right now, but we will be in touch. Everyone note this last thing Mario put in here about the historical markers on the east side. We'll talk to Mario, try to surface more of that, and that's similar to other work that's happening in the city that we'll be telling you guys all about. We're 3 minutes over, so I want to let everyone go, but I have two things to say. One is that we're just super grateful that you guys all joined us. Watch and listen for more from us, the Narrative Change Project, the H.E. Buck Foundation. You can find our website. We'll be sending you guys all an email with ways to make sure you're tracking with more of our events and storytelling experiences and work that we're doing, and trying to bring more things like this to your attention. You're all free to go, but if you want to stay for 2 minutes, you're welcome to, and you're going to hear from our next Lunch and Learn event featured speaker, who is Mark Minjavar. Mark, are you still with us?
I am here.
So Mark, yeah, why don't you, first of all, thank you again, Carey Latimore. Thank you, Dacry, for kicking us off today. That was fantastic. Thank you. And Carey, we'll be looking forward to talking to you lots more in the weeks and months ahead, and just continuing this relationship with you and with the work that you're doing in San Antonio.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. So Mark, what can we expect from you? Is it 2 weeks from now that we're doing this?
I think it's next week, actually. Next week.
All right.
Well, Carey, thank you so much for sharing. And I could not think of a better follow-up to this talk, because for the past 4 months, I've been working with over 500 young people from our city to answer the question, what do we want our city to be? And these students have written a new collective manifesto for our city, and will be inviting us to join them in living into that. They've developed over 200 new monuments for our city. And this work right now is installed at the Museum here in town, which is a great institution. That exhibition just opened yesterday. And so next week, students from the CAST network will be joining us to share that work and inviting us to join them in transforming our city. They've also written some amazing poetry. And if you were inspired yesterday by Amanda Gorman, join us, because you will be inspired by the young poets from our own city. So hope to see you there, and hope that you will join us in joining them to live into this new vision that they're putting forward for us.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Excited. I love the idea. Amanda Gorman is incredible, but not exceptional. There are other amazing young voices out there that we get to hear from, especially thanks to work like yours, Mark. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Great to be with y'all today. Thanks again, Dr. Latimore. We'll talk to you all soon.